So let's talk through every single faction in Warhammer 40k, who's doing best and who's doing worse, and how many games are they winning in tournaments. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought it was high time to take another look through the factions of Warhammer 40k, and look at which of them are over and underperforming and how much, now the dust is settling on the 10th edition launch and the initial balance passes. In the video we'll talk through each faction in turn, and put them in their ranking in the overall leaderboard of Warhammer 40k right now, seeing which ones perhaps might need a bit of a helping hand from Games Workshop, and which of them are probably heading for nerfs. For this list, I thought we'd primarily look at overall faction win rates at tournaments, so basically overall how many games the faction is winning or losing against its peers. Obviously win rates by themselves don't give the entire picture, they can be skewed by all sorts of things, such as the type of players that play the faction, particularly when you get to low sample sizes, which might just be a faction that only tends to be played if they're competitive. Plus pure win rates don't account for some other things, the differences between different factions playing on different terrain sets, and how it might actually hide that they're matching up well against certain things but badly against others. Overall though, I still think it's one of the best rough and ready metrics for seeing army power. Generally a faction with a tournament win percentage in the 60s is usually going to have an easy time against one in the 30s. As well as that, we'll also talk through the number of big tournaments that they've won in 10th edition, though I'd say that this is a little bit less helpful than it could be early on. There haven't actually been that many of them, and the ones that have happened have tended to be won by just a very small subset of factions, as I'm sure you could guess. The ones that are breaking through though are a good sign of success. I think it is also useful to know the player rates for each faction as well. If people are playing each army more, then it's usually a sign of perceived strength, though there will be practical considerations to that. Not everyone collects every army and can just go out and run it at events, so there's a bit of a balance between that compared with factions that are just popular anyway. Overall though, I think it's fairly safe to say that 10th edition isn't particularly balanced right out of the gate. Loads of factions are out of Games Workshop's target 45 to 55% zone, maybe more towards the bottom end of the tier than towards the top. It does seem that just a few armies are really quite massively overpowered, though even if those were toned down a fair bit, I think they'd still have issues with a bunch of very powerful stuff waiting in the wings to fill in for them, and lots of things are in dire need of help. Hopefully after a balance pass or two, 10th edition will be looking a little bit more playable for more armies, at least at a competitive level. Let's kick off then and start out with perhaps the factions that are struggling most in Warhammer 40k right now. These guys are either at or below a 40% win rate, really quite dire to be honest, and here we have the leagues of Votann, Death Guard, Grey Knights, Tau Empire, Blood Angels and Adeptus Mechanicus. These guys generally don't tend to be played that much at grand tournaments as a result, and this section in general is just massively bigger than it was in 9th edition 40k. Previously you just had say Adeptus Mechanicus and a couple of the less played Space Marine chapters chilling out down here. To have 8 major factions listed here really isn't too good for the amount of armies that are struggling to be played competitively in 40k right now. As we go through, let's rank them up on a big faction win percentage chart. Anything in red is 40% wins or below, anything in green is 50% or above. Running through the struggling factions quickly, the Leagues of Votann appear to be the single worst performing army in Warhammer 40k so far. A 29% win rate is truly quite low, obviously no big event wins, and out of the 26 major factions they're the 5th least played. Their judgment tokens are a lot harder to come by than they were in 9th edition. They are still powerful, though you really need to get to 2 of them for the +1 to wound before they really get good. Their detachment is a little bit underwhelming, just marking one target early with a command point reward, but in general their datasheets have just lost a massive amount of power with things like rules like void armor and hitting on 4+s generally, and they haven't come down in points cost quite enough to make them worth it. For some of their better units, lots of people seem to be running large amounts of Einhir Hearthguard, maybe backed up by some Graviton Thunderkin. Carls and the special characters are generally okay, though not outstanding, and the Land Fortress and Sagittars are both usable. I think Games Workshop has just badly misjudged this faction at the moment, costing everything a bit too high for what it really does, maybe not anticipating just how far the faction would fall down the rankings if they did take away their fairly godly damage mechanics with the auto-wounding judgment tokens. They still suffer from quite a few of the similar issues, not being enormously fast and being kind of short-ranged. I don't think many people will be too surprised to see Death Guard down here. A 32% win rate overall, again no big event wins, and seem to be the second least played major faction at grand tournaments, perhaps kind of surprising as they are a fairly popular faction, as they were the launch faction of 8th edition alongside Primaris Marines. Their gift of Nurgle for the -1 toughness is less useful than it was before, given the obscene toughnesses of plenty of vehicles. Their spread the sickness detachment rule might be good for a victory point or two in some games due to their sticky objectives, but a lot of the time just might as well not exist. And again, the vast majority of their datasheets just seem kind of misjudged, Lethal hits isn't enough to carry their damage output against stronger targets, and almost all of their units are less durable for the cost than they were in 9th edition due to the loss of Disgustingly Resilient. For better units, I feel like some of their characters are still at least fairly efficient, though maybe lack the efficient profiles to buff particularly. The Tallyman, Biologus Putrefier, and Blightspawn are all kind of fine. Plague Burst Crawlers and Demon Engines are alright. I saw at least someone had some success running Mortarion in one list, and perhaps a Lord of Contagion or Virulence leading some Death Shroud, maybe coming in with rapid ingress to deliver them. Overall though, just a faction where Games Workshop could probably afford just to give them a sweeping army-wide special rule to help out their durability, or some fairly significant points cost cuts army-wide. Even though their average models seem at least fairly cheap, they just really don't do a lot compared with a bunch of their other Space Marine peers. Next up, and also struggling a whole load, of Grey Knights with their win rate of 37%, a faction that quite a lot of people were kind of optimistic on given their army previews. Fairly massive teleportation abilities, jumping them all over the board, but when we got the full rules out for them, it turned out that really quite a lot of their datasheets were just incredibly lackluster in terms of damage for the cost, and the fairly amazing movement shenanigans aren't enough to save them from that. With the Teleport Assault, it allows units to redeploy at the end of the enemy turn and deep strike in yours, and get some slightly bigger advances, which I think is kind of questionably useful really. I think even their teleport redeploy rules maybe aren't quite as good as some people would estimate. You still need to engage your foe at some stage, and some armies can be very good at screening out 9 inches, so you might just basically be still engaging your foe on the front lines anyway. A lot of lists seem to revolve around building Terminator blocks backed up by characters now, particularly Librarians and Caldor Drago. Some of their power armoured units aren't too bad, but in general quite a lot of the army just struggles to deal with big harder targets, which is kind of essential in 10th edition with boosted toughness values on vehicles. Grey Knights perhaps don't have a whole load of answers to things like Imperial Knights. I think some points cuts would help for the faction, perhaps particularly for walkers like the Dread Knight, which kind of needs to do a fair bit of heavy lifting for the faction and deal with hard targets, but just isn't really pointed to be able to do that right now. Next up, and on 38% wins, are the Tau Empire. Again, no big tournament wins, though I'd say compared with a fair few of the other factions that are ranked down here, they have had a fairly respectable amount of tournaments, putting them either on podiums or going 4-1. It seems that, like before, in 9th edition, they're still an army that have a fairly high skill ceiling, but are just hard to use for the average player. Perhaps at least a tiny bit more scope for tangling with the bigger hitting armies if they're played perfectly, though obviously quite weak overall. They are being played quite a lot more than the other ones mentioned so far, the 11th most played faction at grand tournaments, certainly not fallen off quite as hard as the Death Guard perhaps. They are at least a fairly popular faction normally I suppose, plus I feel like their index is a bit more interesting than the Death Guard's maybe. Some units have some pretty cool tricks, even if the combined sum doesn't add up to a hugely competitive army. Their special rules are the greater good for paired +1 ballistic skill, plus Cao Yon for better damage output later in the game, and some of their more commonly played enhancements are through Unity Devastation for a bit of a damage buff against one unit, and early Cao Yon for a big unit of Crisis Suits with some exploding sixes. Crisis Suits can be pretty nice with their jump shoot jump stratagem as well. Otherwise, you might see some ghost kills lurking around using Lone Operative to stay alive far longer than they might have otherwise. Piranhas loaded up with Seeker missiles, and broadsides with heavy rail rifles to deal a bit of anti-tank damage, Shadow Sun for some rerolls and command point farming, and some big hitting Crisis Suits with some mass cyclic ion blasters, quite efficient against most medium targets. They perhaps don't have quite as much synergy as some of the other shooting armies out there though, and they still have the main issue of not really being all that tough for holding down midfield objectives. They'd often want to shoot the enemy dead and then take the land, but you need to push up early and that can be a bit of a game of cat and mouse if two important damage dealers get killed too fast. Next up, and it seems bringing up the rear for the Space Marines, are the Blood Angels, seeming to be one of the lowest performing Space Marine factions at tournaments right now with a win rate of 39%, and again being a fairly niche army at the moment, 19th most played at grand tournaments. They seem to be doing at least a little bit better with the Gladius Task Force than the Sons of Sanguinius, though not too much in it. As Space Marines, they do get the big Oath of Moment rerolls, and often lists are including at least a bit of shooting to take some good advantage of that. If you go in Sons of Sanguinius, it's +1 strength and +1 attack on the charge, so combat units are more valued there. The stratagems perhaps aren't super outstanding though. Maybe Red Rampage is a solid enough damage buff, though they will miss the mobility that the Gladius brings a little I think. For stronger units in the army, the Death Company seem pretty nice with Power Fist and Inferno Pistol for 31 points each. The Martis could be an interesting enough choice to lead them, with some big damage boosts for them. Otherwise, just about any efficient Space Marine combat units are pretty nice. Assault squads are played quite a bit with their big mortal wound impact hits, plus perhaps Sanguinary Priest or Dante to lead them into battle. It is a shame that perhaps their other iconic jump infantry, the Sanguinary Guard, are just horribly overcosted at the moment. I feel like at the moment they perhaps show a little bit of the balance between Space Marine melee versus Space Marine shooting. I do think that Oath of Moment is a little bit easier to use for gunline armies as opposed to combat ones. Finally, for the more struggling armies, we've got the Adeptus Mechanicus. They're winning around about 40% of games at the moment, perhaps a little bit more than I might have guessed from initial impressions. I did think that they were perhaps going to be one of the very weakest armies in the game. Still obviously in dire need of help, people really don't seem to be too excited to run AdMech in tournaments, as it looks like they're perhaps the least played major faction at tournament games right now. I guess that perhaps the 40% win percentage might be being propped up a little bit by some very specific builds, things like mass breaches, and then supported by a bunch of knights or imperial agents. There's a lot of datasheets in the codex that are just very underwhelming and just don't compete well with just things like mass Cataphron spam. The army rules Doctrine or Imperatives, which either gives you heavy or assault weapons and some AP buffs or debuffs. I think it's useful enough, particularly for a bit of extra movement to get line of sight on things, but only does apply to a subset of the units and doesn't help melee at all, which is kind of sad. Their radiation bombardment can cause some first turn battle shock and potentially chips away with some mortal wounds, but in a lot of games I think has got a very good chance to do almost nothing important whatsoever. Though I would say that their stratagems are kind of okay. Options for advance and charge, a reactive -1 to wound in the fight phase, return fire and a 4+ invulnerable. Perhaps that and their enhancements are some of the better bits out of their core rules. As mentioned, Cataphron breaches seem to be holding down quite a lot of the army, maybe with a couple of vanguards to allow them to reroll, and led by various flavours of tech priests which can give them stealth or damage boosts to hit, and you could perhaps have a tech priest manipulus with the omni sterilizer and the transonic cannon that can give you a whole bunch of mortal wounds against infantry. AdMech is perhaps a little bit oversaturated with options for little interference skirmish units that aren't going to do too much. I think quite a lot of the codex falls into that category at the moment, with few options for things that you actually want on the main battle line. Overall, quite a lot of the datasheets are just quite expensive, maybe Rangers in particular as a bad example, and again they feel like an army that you could just lower the points cost on the vast majority of things in the codex, or perhaps afford to give them back their ballistic skill 3+, which a lot of units lost. Moving on, and next we get into some factions that are considered underperforming. These are ones that are between 41 and 45%, all outside of Games Workshop's theoretical target of 45 to 55% for most armies, and while I think some of them have at least a fair few more interesting choices than the ones down ranked below, they're not exactly in a hugely better place. Putting them on our leaderboard here we have the Astra Militarum, the World Eaters, the Space Wolves and Drukhari, Dark Angels, and then Adepta Sororitas, leading the way for this section. First up, we start with the hard-bitten Imperial Guard, an army that wasn't exactly doing particularly well out of the gate in 10th edition, and then have had a rather big nerf to perhaps their strongest element in their artillery, Manticores, Basilisks and Earthshaker platforms and things going up in points, but not being backed up with any other points cuts on any of their more underwhelming units. Currently they're winning around about 41% in tournaments. They did win one big event, though I think that was before they had the artillery nerf, though they do remain quite a commonly played army at tournaments, 10th most played faction overall. Guard again are a very popular army that have got loads of dedicated players. The army rule is to have some orders, 3-inch movement for move, a +1 to hit at range or melee, and +1 to saves, and the detachment rule, Born Soldiers, now gives you lethal hits if static, a bit more problematic and not as generally useful, tends to help out static things like artillery, rather than the things that need to push up or gain line of sight. Reinforcements is perhaps the other major thing, 2 command points to just flat out respawn a unit on death, really quite nice on things like scout or armoured sentinels, or maybe big infantry blocks. For standout units, scout sentinels are pretty amazing, okay damage with las cannons and hunter killer missiles, and very tough screening, then respawn them. Lord Solar and Ursula Creed together are an excellent command point generation system, plus spit out some great orders. Basilisks, Manticores and Earthshaker platforms are all excellent artillery despite the nerfs, and 20-strong Deathcore Krieg infantry units in particular, with a marshal for some feel no pain, are really quite durable blocks to hold the midfield. I think for their main issues, still a lot of guard units are fairly easily killed in the context of 10th edition, particularly the Lehman Russes, which don't feel very good at the moment for the amount of points that they cost. I think they could really use a few of their mainland battle tanks being a lot more efficient than they are right now. The traditional things that are supposed to do the most damage in the faction just are kind of underwhelming due to the points. Next up, we've got the World Eaters, again on 41% wins, no big event wins, and really quite an unpopular faction here. The 4th least played faction at grand tournaments, though maybe not too surprising seeing as they're not enormously strong, and also they're really quite new as a standalone faction with their own codex, say not as many players as say core Chaos Space Marines or some of the others. World Eaters are perhaps slightly struggling as a more dedicated melee army in an edition where melee is struggling at least a little bit. A lot of the top armies do tend to be a bit more shooty these days, and it probably doesn't help that one of the more popular factions is Adeptus Custodes, very good at countering dedicated melee armies with their fights first shenanigans. The World Eaters do have some fun stuff going for them though. Blessings of Khorne for various powerful buffs, including potentially advancing and charging and also +2 to moves. They can charge very, very far if you manage to get both of those going. And then when they get there, they get extra melee damage from their Berserker Warband charge rules. You could potentially do enormous first turn charges with potentially, say, Lord Invocatus and a whole bunch of 8-band or Exalted units moving up. Maybe combined with a Land Raider charge if you're feeling generous, perhaps. Though I must admit, 8-band do seem to be very, very costly at the moment. Angron seems pretty usable for its cost, plus has the power to respawn now, even if it's not quite as reliable. Berserkers are useful, they might struggle to punch up against tough targets now, and Khan and the Master of Executions could be good to lead them. Perhaps by their very nature, the World Eaters are pretty monodimensional in just charging forward into combat, a little bit on the predictable side. A fair few lists choose to get a little bit of fire support with some War Dog Brigands allied in from the Chaos Knights. The Space Wolves are also here on 41%, again another one of the lower performing Space Marine chapters, and this one even more so than the Blood Angels. The Gladius Strike Force seems to have a massively better win percentage for them compared with their own unique detachment with the Sagas that are annoying to unlock. Again, really quite a rarely played faction, 20th most played at grand tournaments these days, not a whole load of people having faith in Space Wolves to carry them to victory. I think for the weakness of their launch detachment, the Sagas certainly don't help. All of them can be done by characters, but unreliably so, I'd say. There's a good chance that any one of them that you want just isn't going to happen, or at least perhaps not until too late in the game where it doesn't make too much difference. I'm not super convinced on their stratagems or enhancements as well, and a few of their datasheets just punch a little bit less hard than they did before, such as the Wolfen with the damage 1 weapons. For units, at least the Thunderwolf Cavalry can get damage 2 on the charge, better than a fair few other Marine Assault units these days, and they are quite cheap at 33 points per model. Hounds of Morkai could actually be interesting enough with devastating wound melee. They do seem a lot stronger than Reavers. A lot of their unique datasheets aren't super outstanding for the cost though, I think. Next up we've got Drukhari, 41% of wins, and doing a little bit better for player rate at 16th most played major faction at the moment. Not awful for the Drukhari, as they tend to be a little bit more niche than most maybe, though I think it's safe to say that a bunch of people's lists will have changed a bit recently. Their army rule is some big hit rerolls from Power from Pain, Real Space Raiders getting you a few more to start on, and then you can plug those into units for big damage increases in-game. Currently the majority of Drukhari units seem to be better at range than melee, which is a bit of an about-face for the faction. They have lost access to easy advance and charge these days, at least unless you pay a stratagem for it. Ravagers in particular, and maybe even the Void Raven, seem useful enough for massive anti-tank fire, perhaps backed up by some Kabbalite warriors and maybe some racks to score objectives. Maybe one witch squad with Lilith Hesperax, as she's got quite a good datasheet as well. I think there's a lot of units here that could afford to come down in cost though. Much of the codex is a bit underwhelming, perhaps particularly the actual standard witch datasheet, which seems really quite bad. The army might be kind of snowbally as well, depending on whether or not you get early kills to get more pain tokens and then feed them into more damage, or if you struggle to get the first few, you might struggle to get the damage train rolling. Dark Angels have a 42% win rate, and again for them the Gladius does seem to be doing better compared with their unique detachment, the one that weirdly makes Battle Shock better, and a lot of their enhancements and stratagems are just a little bit underwhelming unless the unit is Battle Shocked. Very weird game design, I thought. They are seeing at least a reasonable amount of play, perhaps partly driven by Lionel Johnson being quite a popular character with a recent model coming out. I do think that he himself is interesting enough in game, certainly spectacularly hard to kill, though he does cost an enormous chunk of points for the privilege of that. Otherwise, Azrael is quite a nice chapter master leader, I think. Could be nice with a big block of Hellblasters. And I do quite like the big Deathwing Terminator command squad as well, with things like the Apothecary and Banner and Champion all built in, all in one unit. I think perhaps their main weakness is their launch detachment though. A few interesting stratagems, but most of the rest just seems very underwhelming compared with other options in the game. Finally for this section we've got the Adepta Sororitas, 43% wins, and again maybe a little bit better than I might have guessed initially. Again, they really aren't being played all that much, people don't seem to be very excited to put them on the table at the moment, maybe partly due to a lot of their more iconic units like Repentia, Retributors, and Zephyrim and things not being anywhere near as strong as they used to be, and perhaps some of the stronger sisters lists actually going fairly heavily into their armour with things like Castigators or Exorcists on the board. I think that Miracle Dice is still a very strong mechanic, though it just doesn't seem to be enough to carry the army to greatness at the moment. But their detachment rule, Blood of the Martyrs, I think is a little bit situational and dependent on your opponent killing part of a squad rather than all of them, not that reliable to have when you've got toughness 3 infantry. Locked squad sizes and short-range melter have both been 2 other blows to the faction. Multi-belted retributors, in particular wounding on 5s, are really quite painful, and quite a lot of their melee seems somewhat underwhelming compared with Bloody Rose. At least numbers-wise, they do seem to be doing it a little bit better than a few of the other struggling factions in the game, though not by a lot. I'm not sure it's really the ideal place to be in when Sisters players are incentivized to make fairly heavy use of tanks plus maybe allied armigers. A lot of their elite infantry just aren't doing quite as well. Celestian Sacrosancts could be okay, I suppose, maybe some Seraphim, and perhaps one Battle Sister squad to farm some Miracle Dice on a home field objective might be some okay choices for a more balanced list. Moving onwards and upwards, here are the armies that are between 45% and 49%, armies that I'd currently consider to be fairly well balanced, at least externally, in Warhammer 40k. I feel like this sort of win percentage is quite nice for the factions ranked here, though obviously a lot of these have plenty of units that are kind of underwhelming, and Games Workshop could certainly work more on their internal balance to make everything a bit more viable. For the most part, I'd rate these as being able to punch up a little bit against the stronger factions with a good list played well, and hopefully they're in a place where Games Workshop wouldn't think about nerfing them. Here they are put onto the main leaderboard, and here we have Black Templars and Space Marines, Chaos Knights, Orks, Necrons, and Chaos Space Marines. The Black Templars do seem to be one of the better flavours of Space Marines that you can field these days, a win rate of 46%, and 17th most played faction in grand tournaments, and unlike the first 3 that we've talked about, they actually seem to prefer their own detachment with their Righteous Crusaders overtaking the Gladius strike force. I guess that and a better win percentage goes hand in hand, actually having something major to offer bar just their unique datasheets. For their army rules, they still get the Oath of Moment with some big Space Marine to hit rerolls, perhaps often used on Redemptor Dreadnoughts, and then their detachment rule is Templar Vows, your choice of 4 different boosts pre-game. Lots of people often opting to go for 6+ Feel No Pain for simple durability boost, though you can flex into any of the others if it makes more sense. They've got a nice stratagem for a 4+ to prevent fallback, and between the 10 houses bone enhancement plus Grimoldus, you could potentially have a 5+ Feel No Pain on 2 different squads. Perhaps one with some meaty assault terminators, maybe one with an enormous Crusader squad perhaps. For stronger units, both flavours of Crusader squads I think are really quite nice. Really quite cheap marine bodies. The Primaris one can put a lot of cheap marines on the tabletop with chainswords. The non-Primaris one is quite a nice backfield unit, 75 points for 5 marine bodies, and can pack something like a las cannon as well. Sword Brethren are pretty efficient melee, and out of the characters, Helbrecht and Grimaldus seem perhaps the most standouts. Overall, I think they're in a fairly okay place, not exactly outstanding, but not as behind the curve as many. There are perhaps a few annoyances, like things like vehicles are locked into multi-melters even if they don't want to take them due to Games Workshop's new ingenious points cost system. Plus, as with a few of the other things, Oath of Moment can be a bit better to deploy with more shooting armies, and in general I'd say that Gladius does that a little bit better than Black Templars. Overall though, doing solidly enough. Their win percentage would be a bit better if Games Workshop took down the very strongest armies in the game, I suspect. Otherwise, for the more standard Space Marines, their win rate is 46%. They have won one big tournament, though I believe that was before their Primaris Desolation squad nerf. They certainly did seem to be carrying the faction for a bit after the release, what with their massively undercosted barrage damage plus direct damage. They're certainly not standout good at the moment, but they remain the 5th most popular played faction at grand tournaments. That's not including all of the divergent chapters like Blood Angels and Dark Angels and things. They are just a very widely played army, and maybe a little bit of an over-representation with newer players to the faction, which might well impact the win rates for a percentage point or 2 maybe. We have touched on it a few times before, but their army rule is Oath of Moment for big focal damage, really quite nice for anything that's just trying to tank things on raw durability, okay against Knights or Custodes perhaps. The detachment rules are the Gladius combat doctrines, 3 different turns that allow different flavours of move faster or further and do damage, and then ability to flex into them with stratagems and get some extra damage and defensive buffs elsewhere. Their Bolter Discipline enhancement is quite a nice one as well, paired with some good firepower units, maybe some Stern Guard or Hellblasters, or even those Desolation Marines still. For their better units, I still think that the Ignores line of sight is pretty powerful, particularly combined with Oath of Moment. Gives you the chance to stack a lot of damage on something that your opponent really doesn't want hit. I think it's still worth having a little bit of. You can run things like Incursors and the Stormspeeder Hail Strike for extra focal damage on certain units. A bunch of their armor's really pretty usable with things like Repulsors, the Gladiator Lancer, or the Redemptor Dreadnought. Guilliman is very nice for his double Oath of Moment in the same turn to get maximal firepower. And perhaps some of the better HQs are things like Captains for free stratagems and Librarians for 4+ invulnerable saves. On the flip side, I would say that Space Marines do have a lot of things that kill them really quite easily. Lots of AP-1 damage 2 things in the game at the moment, which goes through the standard Space Marine stat line pretty fast. And while they have an absolute ton of options, they still have an absolute ton of outclassed or overshadowed units. Overall not too terrible for them, fairly slap bang in the middle of the factions in Warhammer right now. Maybe slightly carried there by just a few standout units though. Next up, we've got the Chaos Knights at 47% wins, really quite popular in grand tournaments at the moment, the 7th most played faction, as perhaps a particularly easy army to pick up and play competitively if you'd like to. But they certainly seem to be a fair bit behind their Imperial cousins, who are just massively outcompeting them just with raw damage and defense, as opposed to all the Battleshock tricks that the Chaos Knights can bring. Their army and detachment rules really go hard into Battleshock, leadership debuffs, and you have to test Battleshock when you're under top strength, plus you get extra damage against Battleshock's units from turn 3 onwards. I would say that going so much into Battleshock is just very unreliable. A lot of units are just going to pass those tests even if debuffed, and it's just not quite as reliably good as extra damage and defensive buffs that the Imperial Knights have in spades. The Chaos Knights got hit by a bunch of towering nerfs the same as the Imperial Knights. I feel like perhaps Games Workshop could have used the opportunity to hit the Chaos Knights a little bit less hard, but it did seem to be fairly equal. As a result, and perhaps a little bit annoyingly, like in 9th edition, it does look like War Dog spam is perhaps the most competitive list that you can build with Chaos Knights, a bunch of Brigands in particular, maybe backed up by some Huntsmen and Stalkers. I don't think the big Chaos Knights are unplayable though, the Rampager, Despoiler and Desecrator all being usable enough. The Abominant feels a little bit underpowered right now though. Overall not really in the worst place, fairly mid-tier and can be a bit of a stat check for some armies still. If you can't deal with a massive amount of high toughness vehicle wounds, you're going to be in trouble. Next up, with a win rate of 48%, we have the Orks, perhaps doing just a little bit better than I might have guessed at the very start of the edition. It does seem like they're not being run by a huge amount of players at the moment, only 14th most played competitively at the moment. I'd still say that that's perhaps unusually low for a very popular army in general. Orks do seem, as ever, to maybe just be very locked into a few key choices to run up the board and hit you with. They seem very melee focused between both the War rules for advance and charge and melee buffs, plus also the sustained hits from their War tribe, and a lot of their shooting units just seem kind of underwhelming right now. For stronger choices, Grots make pretty cheap objective control and command point farming duties. The Squigosaur boss and Mozrog Scragbad are pretty mighty melee. Shocks can deliver things into combat pretty nicely, and maybe the bulk of the damage being done by things like Meganobs, Knobs, Squig Hogs and Beast Snagger Boys, maybe with a few mech guns for fire support, and some commandos or storm boys to take objectives. A lot of the walkers and buggies though really feel like they've had a bit of a raw deal this time round. Hopefully Games Workshop give them some buffs at some stage. Overall not doing terribly. They might struggle a bit to punch up against tanks for some units, and being dependent on getting into melee is a little bit worse of a thing in 10th edition. There's quite a lot fewer movement shenanigans that you can do in the charge and fight phase, and again the existence of Custodes probably isn't great news for them. Next up, we've got the Undying Legions of the Necrons, winning around about 48% of games, same as Orks, and they have managed to take down one big tournament, though not exactly sweeping events left, right and centre. A very, very popular faction at the moment, 4th most played at big events, perhaps unsurprising given just how many people were playing them in 9th edition, being one of the launch factions. Their army rule, reanimation protocols, gives you some nice resurrecting and reviving models. Pretty underwhelming just on its own right, I think, but with the amount of buffs that you can get on it between reanimators, resurrection orbs, and a bunch of other stuff, you're generally in for a good time, particularly when applied to big blocks of Lich Guard or maybe Necron warriors. Their command protocols, I think, work fairly well. They've got a bunch of very efficient, cheap support characters like Cryptex that can trigger it, plus it makes a lot of their stratagems absolutely amazing for the command point cost. Things like re-rolling wounds or reactive reanimation, there's a lot of nice things. I think a lot of lists will want to build around those core blocks with reanimators plus resurrection orb support plus some cryptex, maybe add in a couple of cryptothralls to the unit for yet more tanky durability, and there are plenty of options for heavy hitters to move around them, things like the Transcendent Catan with the Eternal Weave and the Void Dragon to kill some tanks, maybe some Locust Destroyers with their massive damage 6 or enmity exterminators, or Doomsday Arcs or maybe even Monoliths for some heavy hitting against enemy tanks. For the most part though, outside of their massively stacked units, their durability isn't standout maybe, and they are still a little bit slow and ponderous. The Lich Guard and the Warriors don't have outstanding damage output for the cost after all the investment. They do need to gradually chip away at enemy forces. Definitely can be very intimidating though if well supported, means that you just might struggle to take out big blocks of these things, and then they'll be able to attack you back in return. Finally for this level, and now certainly getting towards the stronger factions of Warhammer 40k, are Chaos Space Marines. 49% win rate here, again no big event wins, though several very high placings, and a popular faction in game, 9th most played overall at grand tournaments. I think Chaos Marines have perhaps some of the most interesting stack synergies of armies that you can do. Their Dark Pacts rule gives you some nice extra damage output, and then it gets much better with their Marks of Chaos from their detachment rule, selecting one of the deities' marks and then getting big boosts to your packs depending on what you've chosen. The Chaos Space Marine stratagems I think are standout good as well. The Nurgle one can prevent shooting at greater than 12 inches, the Undivided one can give you some enormous damage rerolls, and some of the enhancements are pretty nice as well, say the 5+ Feel No Pain one on a Demon Prince. For some melee hammers in the army, I'd be most tempted by Terminator blocks or Possess blocks, backed up by characters, and both going very heavily into the Dark Packs. Forge Fiends and Obliterators are both really quite nice fire support. I think Chosen are interesting enough for 3 wounds at their points cost, and Accursed Cultists with their regeneration I think could be pretty nice when buffed, particularly with Abaddon's 4+ Invulnerable save. In general I think they're a strong enough army, maybe a little bit reliant on their pacts and big synergy to have damage outputs, and can be a bit on the unreliable side with a few bad rolls giving you a whole bunch of mortal wounds. They do need to keep their command points flowing as well. Again, I think a lot of their power does come from those powerful stratagems. Moving into the next tier up, and these are the armies that currently have a win percentage of 50 to 54%. A couple of these are a bit borderline compared with being the lower tier down, but I think by now we're certainly getting to the armies that can bring some very scary stuff to the table, or some really powerful shenanigans that other armies might struggle to deal with. I think having 50% or more, particularly when there's some excessively powerful armies in the game, is really quite standout, and if some of the top factions get some more nerfs, then these guys could be waiting in the wings to take up titles of strongest armies in the game. Putting them onto our leaderboard here, and here we have ranked Deathwatch and Tyranids both on 50%, Chaos Demons on 51%, Thousand Suns on 52%, and Adeptus Custodes up on 54% wins. Starting out, we've got the Bugs from Beyond the Galaxy with the Tyranids. The 10th edition launch faction does seem to be at least fairly good straight out of the gate. 50% wins is maybe a little bit better than I was expecting, and they do have some powerful options within their index, but I must admit I do think that at least a little bit of this is explained by the shenanigans and scoring things that they can do with spore mines. Having just a couple of Biovores sitting in your backfield throwing spore mines where you need them on the board can just be so good for certain secondary objectives at time of recording. If the opponent hasn't perfectly screened out their entire deployment zone, they can technically score things like behind enemy lines or deploying teleport homers. They can be fired out to the corners of the board or thrown around for engaged on all fronts, and it's just going to add up to a bunch more victory points over the course of the game. They can just be pretty annoying at slowing down the enemy advance onto midfield objectives as well. My guess is that if Games Workshop does choose to change the rules a bit for Biovore spore mines scoring tactical objectives, Tyranids probably will lose a few percentage points worth of win rate. At present though, I feel like their army is generally strong enough to carry the midfield and have at least a decent scrap with most armies in the game. They have won 3 big events so far in 10th edition, and are currently really quite popular at the moment, perhaps unsurprisingly, the 6th most popular faction played at grand tournaments. Their army-wide rule Shadow in the Warp can be helpful situationally in some games, though I don't think it's that reliable given that it's battle shock based. Maybe it could be good for a chance at some victory points on an objective at some point. Perhaps a bit more meaningful are their adaptations that they get from their invasion fleet, particularly nice if you happen to be playing an enemy army that's skewed all to one type of target. Beyond that, respawning gaunts can be handy enough, and also that 5+ Feel No Pain stratagem, probably good enough to use that one twice a turn with a Hive Tyrant giving you an extra copy of it. For standout units in the swarms, they've got some pretty nice monsters. The Haruspex, Tyrannifex, Exocrine and Maleceptor are all rather nice, maybe with a walking Hive Tyrant to lead them. Zoanthropes put out a good battery of anti-tank or anti-infantry fire. Barb Gaunts are some rather nice counter-infantry, and as mentioned, Biovores and Spore Mines score objectives amazingly, as well as being able to slow down the enemy army at certain key points. Maybe still not an absolutely overwhelming, unbeatable powerhouse of a faction, but they do have powerful objectives and enough threats to get the job done against a lot of armies. Also, just nosing it into the 50% or higher bracket are the Deathwatch. Unlike the Tyranids, they're a very unpopular faction, 3rd least played major faction at grand tournaments at the moment, though realistically that's nothing new for them. They are generally one of the least played armies in the game typically. Deathwatch seem to be making the breakthrough as one of the strongest ways to play Space Marines right now, basically being Space Marines but with a much more shooting slant, their detachment rule giving them 3 useful damage boosts on 3 different turns, and then they have a bunch of interesting index rules to support that, giving them things like various flavours of special issue ammunition that can be used on really quite big units that aren't just bolters, and potentially getting double Oath of Moment out of the term of Exoclades. I think a bunch of their kill teams are strong enough to be usable. In particular, the Proteus kill team and even the Deathwatch Terminator squad with 3 Terminators with either Cyclone missiles or assault cannons are rather nice, and the kill team's versions certainly make some very efficient use of stratagems. They are pretty great with the Desolation squads as well, even now they went up in points. Putting anti-infantry 2+ on all those Castellan launchers is rather brutal, certainly means that if there's any infantry on the board, they're going to remove them pretty quickly. Overall, not doing too badly. There might be a little bit of an aspect of them just being played by a few very good players at the moment, which might slightly increase their win rate. And they were a faction where Games Workshop got on top of them early with their Broken Devastating Wounds and Mortal Wounds combo, but that was probably for the best as they could hoover out absolutely masses and masses of Mortal Wounds against infantry each turn. Again, with Space Marines, not super durable in my opinion. A lot of things can take them down fairly fast with AP1 and damage 2. Moving on, we've got Chaos Demons, up at a 51% win rate, though no big event wins so far in 10th edition, and a sort of middling player rate, 13th most played faction in the game at grand tournaments at the moment. Not too bad going for a somewhat niche army, at least a few people are interested in putting them on the table more than usual, I'd say. Their army rule is the Shadow of Chaos with multiple debuffs within their area of control, and then Warp Rifts for close deep strike when you're in shadows. They're still an army that play very differently to most armies in 40k, very combat focused and lots of invulnerable saves, and they do have a stratagem for deep striking very close to the enemy at just outside of 3 inches. That can be pretty powerful for gamey objective things if you can maintain the shadow in the warp control. Several demons armies at the moment tend to build around Be'lakor, shielding a whole bunch of greater demons from ranged firepower for a turn before moving forward to engage the enemy. Be'lakor's just a bit over 300 points, is quite a massive threat in his own right, but he has an aura of stopping enemy shooting at long range, certainly frustrating any backfield fire support that the opponent has, and if they come forward, then they're going to get charged by your greater demons. Then there's quite a lot of demons that people like to run alongside that. Shalaxi Hellbane is a particularly popular choice, so is the Lord of Change and the Bloodthirster, and then they do have really quite a lot of options for cheaper demon units to be running around on objectives, some of them certainly stronger than others though. Perhaps some of the bigger disadvantages are anything with strong bid-board control, countering warp rifts and things, and a few units feeling overcosted. Being very melee dependent might not be excellent against, say, Custodes, and some units might just still have the raw might to beat down the greater demons as they step up to you. They are going to have to engage and throw themselves into damage output at some stage, and maybe don't benefit quite as much from the plentiful cover in 10th edition as much as some heavies for other factions. In general though, doing fairly solidly, above 50% win percentage is pretty nice, though I do think that there's plenty of units in their army that could afford to be buffed. Next up, we're getting into the big 5 factions of Warhammer 40k, and Thousand Sons certainly aren't a surprise to see here. A 52% win percentage, 8th most played major faction in the game at the moment, and 1 big tournament win. Thousand Sons can still somewhat be kind of slow moving, and maybe aren't quite as enormously durable as they might well have been in 9th edition perhaps, but now they can absolutely turn on the damage threat when they want to. You can get massively stacked combos with things like Scarab Occult Terminator shooting, removing enemy army saves, and having big buffs to hit and wound with their psychic powers from Magnus, and then making all their shooting counter psychic attacks with a stratagem for some psychic ammunition. Psychic attacks get even better with their Kindred sorcery, and then they've got Cabal of Sorcerers for the other benefits that can bring as well. Pretty much all of those are good, such as Doom Bolt, Double Move, or even cancelling a failed saving throw. You could potentially deliver one big scary squad where it needs to be with the Umbralific Crystal to get the jump on the enemy. Otherwise, rubrics are pretty efficient, the Mutalith Vortex Beast is good, and Magnus is pretty excellent just for his own regular stats, then back them all up with a few sorcerers to lead the Rubricate into battle. Overall a very strong army right now. There may be still one that needs a little bit more thought put into the play of it rather than some factions, very slow moving, and a whole plethora of choices that you can go for. Next up, we've got the dreaded Golden Boys of the Adeptus Custodes, riding pretty strong with a 54% win percentage at the moment in Warhammer 40k, though interestingly only 2 big event wins, notably one of them being Games Workshop's own Tacoma Open event, where I think it might have been an element of the terrain favouring them, meaning that there was a Custodes versus Custodes final. With those kind of stats, with a massive win percentage but very few big event wins, it does kind of make them into what they'd call a gatekeeper faction, something that you have to beat to get to the top spots in tournaments, wins a lot of games very easily just with raw power, and some factions really can struggle to play into them, but they might be unlikely to take the top spot with perhaps a bit of a lower skill ceiling than some. They do remain a very popular faction at tournaments and things, second most played in tournament games at the moment, perhaps not too surprising, being fairly easy to master, really quite strong just on their raw stats, and also one of the cheapest factions to get into in Warhammer. Their army can stat check a few enemy armies that just won't be able to get through that amount of golden armour stomping up the board. Very big toughness characteristics and big saves, plus Aegis of the Emperor for some defense against mortal wounds, and then the martial Qatar for your choice of favourite stances to fight with in the fight phase. Generally, the Custodian armies tend to go pretty heavy on big blocks of Custodian Guard or Wardens stomping up the board with character support, Shield Captains, Blade Champions, or Trajan Valorist leading them, and then going fairly heavy on their powerful stratagems, fighting first on objectives if you need to, resurrecting Custodes, and -1 damage being a particularly nice one to get free with the Shield Captain. Maybe backing them up, you could have a few Alarus Custodian Terminators. They're quite nice at taking down some of the bigger threats in the enemy army, plus Caladius tanks with the big strength 12 reroll wounds blaze cannons being particularly nice at killing enemy vehicles and knights. Overall, really quite a strong army. Lots of factions are really going to have trouble against them. Maybe biggest issues against armies that actually do have the raw amount of damage to kill their units with focused fire. Maybe things like Imperial Knights, Thousand Sons, and Aeldari in particular. Speaking of which though, we've got 3 factions left in Warhammer 40k. These are the ones who are taking up the podium places in Warhammer at the moment, it would seem, and perhaps to no one's surprise, that's Genestealer Cults, Aeldari, and Imperial Knights. At least until any further balance updates, it looks like Warhammer 40k competitively is a bit of a 2-horse race, with the Aeldari and Genestealer Cults being far superior to most other armies. All 3 of these can be a real challenge for more mid-tier factions. Good lists of these played well are going to be a massive challenge to overcome, and I really wouldn't be too surprised if these get further balance adjustments down the line, probably all 3 of them, but certainly the top 2. Putting them into context here, here's where the Aeldari, Genestealer Cults and Imperial Knights fit in on the list. They are going so far up the chart that I've needed to write their tags the other way up. Looking at the game as a whole, there really does seem to be a spike of these guys, as well as a real drop-off of some of the very weakest armies. And on the middle tiers, maybe a couple of different rungs of the armies that broadly can compete with the top stuff, and the ones that really can't. Talking about the big bads of Warhammer 40k though, and first up we have the Imperial Knights, who are doing quite well despite their nerfs, a win rate of 58% even after the points increases and the changes to towering, and it seems they've won 7 big events throughout 10th edition so far, though 5 of those I believe were prior to the towering nerf and the points increases. Still though, they are winning events even past that, and still appear to be the 3rd most played major faction at grand tournaments at time of recording. Again, like the Custodes, very strong at the moment, and one of the 40k armies that's easier to get your hands on than most given just a few models to paint up. Unsurprisingly, Knights have a lot going for them, enormous vehicle profiles with toughness 10 or toughness 12 on the majority of their units, and unlike the Chaos Knights who mess around with battle shock, these guys just pretty much go in for raw damage and defense. Big rerolls with lay low the Tyrants out of their code chivalric, and some command points if you kill the Warlord. A 6+ feel no pain to make them tougher, which is very handy as you're usually not going to be able to hide them behind terrain. And then some massive stratagems and bondsman abilities that increase their damage output every which way. Towering shooting can be scary and hard to hide from, even with tournaments implementing some fixes to the rule like counting bottom floor ruins as enclosed. And I've got great stratagems like Fight on Death, a +1 to wound against monsters and vehicles, and just tank shock for a bunch of mortal wounds when they charge in. They move fast and they've got good objective control, and you can even have an element of the best of both worlds with some infantry and supporting units as well, maybe taking things like Exaction Squads or Vindicares to capture smaller objectives, and not necessarily having to dedicate a knights to every single role that you need to score with. Generally a mix of big knights and small knights tends to make sense due to the bondsman abilities. For better data sheets, the Crusader definitely stands out with its enormous damage output and +1 to hit. Canis Rex is all-round efficient with his sustained hits on everything, and I quite like Wardens and Paladins as well, sporting either an Avenger Gatling cannon with mortal wounds, or a battle cannon and handing out things like the Lance keyword. Armigers, particularly the Warglaves, are really quite strong, Helverins can help with their anti-fly, and overall it all adds up to some of the strongest firepower that most factions can field in Warhammer 40k. And on fast mobile platforms, some of which you might struggle to hide behind terrain to avoid, they still do have some weaknesses. Certainly if they run into armies that are just entirely set up to deal with enemy tanks, then they're going to have a worse time, and might have a few more issues moving and interacting with terrain than most. Still though, an enormously scary army, loads of raw power, and lots of general purpose firepower scattered throughout that can handle both tanks and infantry well. Next up we have the fearsome Aeldari, certainly being easily spotted by the community as perhaps the single strongest faction in the game when 10th edition dropped, enormously strong datasheets with enormously powerful buffs, and particularly scary mortal wound output with their fate dice fed into devastating wounds weaponry. Games Workshop did hit them at least fairly hard with a nerf, nerfing their fate dice and giving them a slew of points increases, but it only seems to have taken them down from clearly the top faction in the game into one of the strongest too. Aeldari have won an enormous amount of events since the edition started, 18 events overall, and still seem to be doing absolutely great despite the nerfs. I think previously it was the difference of Aeldari tending to win everything, and now having some serious fights for the top spots with Genestealer Cults for the most part, the two factions between them keeping the vast majority of armies out of the top podium place. At least since the start of the edition, Aeldari are the most popular played faction at grand tournaments, though I think that if you redid the numbers now they might have dropped down a place or two, maybe Custodes overtaking them. In general, they're certainly one of the strongest, but they're not quite as popular or widely played as some of the other factions out there in the game. Going through their scary abilities does take a fair while, as they've got quite a lot of them. Strands of Fate is useful for all sorts of purposes, plugging in essentially miracle dice rolls into the most important things. Sixes to hit in Overwatch with things like the biggest guns that they have, like the heavy wraith cannons, is huge. Sixes for devastating wounds to get automatic mortal wounds on your foe is massive, and even things like auto-passing 4+ invulnerable saves is pretty potent too. It was toned down by Games Workshop to only once per phase, so it stops you plugging literally all of the damage output into devastating wounds as fast as possible, but it's still rather big. Then their detachment rule means that they just have some pretty god tier anti-tank from the start. They get to reroll one hit and one wound roll when they're attacking, so that means that basically any single shot weapons like Bright Lances will pretty much be re-rolling everything. As with Master Artisans and Expert Crafters in the past, it's just very reliable extra damage. A few of their enhancements are usable, some of them help out with the Fate dice, and their stratagems I think are particularly strong as well. Lots of movement shenanigans, in particular move shoot move, through two different sources, Fire and Fade and Phantasm. Phantasm's perfect knowledge enemy turn movement is kind of broken I think, almost guarantees that you just can't catch up with one Aeldari unit per turn, not unless you've got literally lots of units swarming their positions and being able to see them from all sides. Getting into their units, and Wraith Knights are towering so you can't hide very easily. They can take a -1 to wound from a Farseer, plus get those automatic sixes that the Farseers can rustle up to feed into their heavy Wraith cannons, or potentially a Farseer doing the same thing with the D-cannon batteries, which are still pretty excellent despite the points hike. Fairly godly damage outputs to threaten the midfield objectives with. Hornets and Fire Prisms between them are great users of the detachment rule to reroll hits for their enormously powerful anti-tank guns. A lone operative Autarch can dance around generating command points all game, plus potentially being an annoying thing to put on objectives. Wraithguard are really solid moving up the board with a Spirit Seer, and then they can combine all that with some fast units jumping onto objectives, Wind Riders or Warp Spiders, and maybe the Incarn thrown in for some disruptive pop-up when you die. In general, on average, Aeldari tend to, at least fairly convincingly, beat most other factions in the game. They're pretty solid against Imperial Knights and Adeptus Custodes, given the sheer amount of damage that they can unleash with all these rerolls and high damage shots, though it seems that their Achilles heel is playing against Genestealer Cults, who generally seem to have a favourable matchup against them. Aeldari kind of being incentivized to go very into their mortal wounds and big hitting lances, which might not exactly be the things that you want to have if you're fighting against a regenerating horde. Otherwise though, a massive challenge for a lot of the strongest armies in Warhammer 40k to play against. When the next balance pass comes around, I'm pretty certain that Games Workshop will nerf a fair bunch of their stuff. Finally, last but by no means least, are the Genestealer Cult. It seems that they're very similar to Aeldari with a win rate of 65%. I think that they've got some good cause to be labelled as the strongest faction in Warhammer 40k right now. As well as having a similar win rate to Aeldari, they actually seem to usually be the victor against Aeldari in their matchup, so are perhaps particularly suited for taking victories on the top tables against them. They've won 9 events so far in 10th edition, which is absolutely massive given how niche a faction they are. Besides Imperial Knights, that's roughly as much as the entire rest of the field put together, and they're doing this while they're only the 12th most played faction in the game, though for Genestealer Cult that's absolutely massive. They're usually one of the very least played factions, so having them above average is kind of surprising. Certainly shows that a lot of people are interested in playing them, and they're doing very well right now. At the moment, Genestealer Cults still have a lot of their crafty shenanigans, but now it seems that a fair bit of their character is they're just an infinitely respawning rebellion, and fighting against them is going to be kind of spooky. You might knock a unit down for it to come back later in the game, and the challenge is perhaps to outscore the opponent over the course of 5 turns, as eventually the cultists will keep on showing up to deal more damage to you. The Blitz game is a bit of a mini game where you get to put a cult ambush marker on the board after your unit's died, but then you do need to put it further away so your opponent can't just wipe it out. And if you can manage that, then you're rewarded by one of your units coming back. They're also excellent out of Deep Strike, with any units coming out of that getting sustained hits 1 and ignores cover, and that also works when things return from Cult Ambush too. Then they've got some very nice stratagems, redeploying their own units at the end of the enemy's turn, a 3-inch Deep Strike stratagem, and some rather good shooting buffs out of Deep Strike which are quite nice on neophytes, and they can stack quite a lot of damage on those units with things like character buffs and other data sheets like the Achilles Ridge Runner. Lots of Genestealer Cult forces usually seem to build around either neophyte hybrids with a whole bunch of seismic cannons, with buffs from things like the Primus, Nexos, and Ridge Runners and Stratagems, giving them some fairly nasty damage output when they come in. It also gives you a big horde with loads of objective control to seize control of points as well. Then you can have a whole load of acolytes throwing around demo charges to take down some harder targets, maybe making some good use of the stratagem to turn up just outside of 3 inches, so they're very hard to screen in Ds. The Reductus Saboteur I think is also very nice for just 55 points, lots of ways that she can deal disruptive mortal wounds, and the Atalan Jackals, if you can deliver them as a fragile unit, can do some big drive-by mortal wounds as well. Potentially powerful on paper, though maybe a little bit harder to use than some people give them credit for. You can also have a big block of aberrants first turn charging by deploying in the midfield as well, and those things are very, very tanky and actually able to take a lot of first turn damage from the foe. In terms of weaknesses, I would rate them as a lot easier to play with than they were before, perhaps a little bit less dependent on getting all of their shenanigans all lined up. The things like fast moving enemy units could wipe out a bunch of blip markers, and the opponent does need to play carefully with that, putting them far enough forward to threaten, but not so far forward that they get taken off the board too easily. They perhaps feel like an army that doesn't have absolutely obscene damage output unless you really focus all of their stratagems and buffs around units. Not always the hardest thing to do in the world, but if you don't manage to stack a bunch of damage buffs, they won't hit quite as hard as you might expect them to, and getting a second wave of attacks might just be cut down in turn. Overall though, very, very strong. A win rate of 65% is certainly very overtuned. And again, in some way, I would expect them to get nerfed next time Games Workshop does a balance pass. I think personally I prefer them just to try and fix them with points really. I do quite like the way that they play with the hordes respawning over and over again. And I feel like provided they can't do too efficient damage to the enemy and they'll be casting down multiple squads, seems like they could be a really interesting faction that's quite strong, while not having the ability to just remove units from the board quite as easily as they do now. With this kind of win rate though, they probably do need to do something about them. It's not just a few skilled players doing well, as I think it might have been a fair bit in 9th edition. So anyway then, hope you've enjoyed a bit of discussion around the tournament performance of the factions of Warhammer 40k, and roughly how well they're doing in game right now. Overall, I do feel that 10th edition at the moment is in a bit of a running in phase, maybe not too different from 8th edition when the indexes came out perhaps. Lots of wildness out there, and some armies that are vastly more powerful than others by ridiculous extents. Hopefully after a balance pass or two, things will be on a bit more of an even keel, with a few more armies out of the red, and hopefully no factions, and hopefully keeping factions out of the 60% plus wins territory. Let me know your thoughts though. As always, I'll appreciate any other insights into these armies if there's anything major that I've missed. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description below if you'd like to help support and keep these videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.